Hello, friends. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and welcome back to my series on the Naassenes, the most important Christian group you have never heard of. They flourished in the late 2nd century or early 3rd century. I think that they are probably based in Alexandria, and they are named most famously after Naas, which is the Greek transliteration for a Hebrew word, nachash, meaning snake. And so it's undeniable that Naassenes have something to do with snakes. But the larger historical question here is whether Naassenes actually called themselves Naassenes, and to what degree the Naassene discourse really is about snakes, because you see some wild claims, even in scholarship, about Naassenes and snake worship. And the refutator who wrote against the Naassenes certainly believed that they worshiped the snake, and he believed that the snake was Satan. So the question here is, what did the Naassenes themselves believe? What role, if any, does the snake or serpent play in their thought and practice? And how can we come to a better understanding without washing away specifically Naassene concerns in a flood of parallels? Now, one could imagine, and indeed many have imagined, that a group named after snakes would be involved in weird snake handling rituals, such as we see in the churches of Appalachia. And that's unfortunately just not true. Epiphanius tells us that so called Ophites had a snake in their worship service, and that the snake would coil around the bread, and that people would kiss the snake. Nothing of the kind do we find reported of the Naassenes. In fact, the really ironic thing about the Naassenes is, though you might be led to believe that they were focused on snakes, the Naassene preacher himself really doesn't talk that much about them. They are not the focus of his discourse. In Ophite Christian literature, we find mention of the bronze snake of Moses, the snake that Moses held up in the desert to heal the Israelites from snake bites sent from the Creator. Jesus mentions this snake in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so the Son of Man shall be lifted up. The Son of Man here is apparently identical with the snake. Jesus is then morphed with the snake and becomes a symbol, or rather, the snake becomes a symbol of Jesus. Unfortunately, we don't hear any of this in the Nicene discourse. The preacher never mentions the bronze snake in the wilderness, and it's probably not safe to infer that he was thinking of it. He does mention several passages in John chapter 3, but interestingly never gets to the passage on Jesus as the bronze snake. And likewise with the Ouroboros serpent, which in the popular imagination is often a symbol for gnosis or Gnostic thinking. The snake biting its own tail is never mentioned by the Nicene preacher, despite the fact that he mentions all sorts of literature and lore and mythology. He does not appear to be familiar with the Ouroboros serpent or interested in that particular serpent. So these snakes, unfortunately, don't seem to have been important to the Naassenes. Ophite Christians are also very distinctive for valorizing the snake who was in charge, apparently, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the snake who encouraged Eve and subsequently Adam to eat from the tree and to become like gods or as gods. This snake, in some Ophite theologies, is a symbol of Jesus, and Jesus in Sethian and Ophite Christianity did portray himself as wanting to get Adam and Eve to eat the tree of knowledge, which the Creator had forbidden them to eat from. Interestingly enough, although the Nicene preacher does interpret Genesis in many places, he doesn't mention this particular passage and he's not interested in this particular snake. And so here again, where you would think that he would be totally fascinated and head over heels, swept off his feet with snakes, trying to find them everywhere, that's just not the case. And then there is the snake in the stars. I refer to the constellation Draco. It's this constellation which Peratic Christians, a group also summarized in the Refutation of All Heresies, this group focused on Draco as a symbol of Christ. And that's very fascinating because they joined the ranks of another apparently Christian group who was allegorizing the poem of Aratus called the Phenomena. But when we get to the Naassene Discourse, we don't see him interested in the stars or in Draco. So there's no focus on the bronze snake of Moses. There's no mention of the Ouroboros serpent. There's no mention of the snake in the Garden of Eden. And there's no mention of Draco in the night sky. So when we actually turn to the Naassene Discourse, we need to be aware that all of these other associations with snakes aren't in the Naassene Discourse, and our best bet is that we focus on what the Naassene preacher actually says. So let us at long last actually take a look at what the Naassene writer says about snakes. And it is very surprising and not that well known. To quote the translation of the Refutation of All Heresies 5.9.12, the Naassene preacher is reported as saying that, quote, all the shrines under heaven are named after Naas. To this snake alone is dedicated every sanctuary, every initiation rite, and every mystery, unquote. Now, this is definitely something significant, and it is something we need to take seriously. In context, it's a bit of a random reflection. We haven't been prepared for Naas as a character. But what fascinates the Naassene preacher is that the name Naas sounds like the Greek word naos, which is the common Greek word for temple or shrine. And so, what this author wants to do, and what this author apparently wants to say, is that in ancient language, that is, language spoken by ancient sages, they named their shrines after the snake because snakes, or this particular snake, Naas, was originally the object of worship for all human beings. And therefore, the ancients simply named all of their shrines for the object of worship in the shrines. This is an astounding claim because when we visit Greco-Roman temples or Egyptian temples today, all of the vast plethora of iconography has been stripped away, and the walls and the floors are mostly bare. But what the Naassene preacher claims is that in every temple there was a symbol of the snake as a kind of faded memory of human beings' primeval worship of the snake. But the snake was a symbol, and it's important to understand what, for the Naassene preacher, this symbol signified. The Naassene preacher said that Naas means or is symbolic of watery substance. To quote him again, apart from it, no being whatsoever, deathless or subject to death, ensouled or soulless, can come into existence. Everything is subject to it. It is the good and contains the beauty of everything in itself. So Naas is water, the essence of water. And when the refutator heard this, he assumed that the Naassene preacher was saying what the ancient philosopher Thales said that water was the source or cause of everything. Well, Thales was referring to physical water, but what the Naassene preacher seems to be referring to is a kind of spiritual water, which itself is symbolic of something higher, the living water, which is symbolic of the Son of Human, who comes into every material object, including rocks and trees, and causes them to exist and live on some level. But the Son of the Human is especially or more profoundly present in the human soul. Everything is subject to the Son of Human, and he is not only called good and the good, but the most beautiful. And so when the Naassene preacher refers to Naas as water, he's thinking also on a higher level. He's thinking of the living water of the Son of Human. This same living water, according to the preacher, is that water which first burst forth from the spring of paradise, from Eden, and split into four branches, branches which he takes to be symbolic of human senses. It's a fascinating image, and I encourage everyone to read it. You can read my translation of the refutation. I have it available on my Patreon. Get the full context of this. It's a profound image. One of the things that's distinctive of the Naassene preacher is he associates the Son of the Human, which is his name for Jesus, with the brain, what he calls the formed brain, the kind of control center of the cosmos, an image of the central network from which all life emerges and all impulses, as it were, all electrical signals. It is the fundamental node hooking all of life together. And it is from this brain that the fundamental spring of life, the spring of living water, flows and flows into creation and nourishes human senses and intelligence. So the Naassene preacher never comes out and says directly that the snake, Naas, is Jesus. What he says directly is that Naas represents watery substance, the living water. But by a series of other connections and networking within the Naassene discourse, we can trace the connections of the symbols. The living water is a symbol of the Edenic spring, which becomes the four rivers, which feeds all life in the universe, which is a symbol of the Son of the Human, which enables human perception and human intelligence. And this force, this universal force, lives inside of our souls and is our soul and is what is redeemed. It is the human higher intelligence. It is Jesus the Blessed, as the Naassene preacher writes. Now, I want to emphasize that this is my interpretation of a highly tangled discourse, a highly complex piece of theology, where the preacher is shifting from symbol to symbol, overwhelming the reader with a series of kaleidoscopic images that flood the reader's imagination and cause them to think deep thoughts. I'm just a guide, or an attempted guide, trying to give you my sense of what the Naassene preacher is saying. But you've got to go read this author for yourselves. If you're interested, I've got my new translation and notes on the Naassene sermon in my forthcoming book, The Naassenes Exploring an Early Christian Identity. You can already check out the Routledge site to get a deal on this book, or join Patreon, where I can also get you a deal on this book. For the moment, I just want to thank everybody sincerely for your help and support. If you have any comments whatsoever, I'm happy to receive them here. I'll answer all questions on Patreon. Thank you again, and take care.